Can you imagine a world where your very existence, your ability to make decisions, your right to even speak for yourself, was entirely controlled by someone else, simply because you were born a woman? A world where your worth was measured not by your intelligence or your spirit, but by the male guardian who held your legal destiny in his hands. Welcome to the Lombard Kingdom in 643, a time when women lived under laws that defined their lives in astonishing ways. Number 6. The unspoken bar to legal testimony and court representation. Picture a bustling Lombard village square, the air alive with the chatter of market traders, the lowing of cattle, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. In the center, a small crowd gathers around a makeshift court, where the king's reeve, a stern-faced man with a heavy cloak, presides over a dispute. A disagreement over a boundary line, perhaps, or a stolen ox. Arguments are shouted, witnesses are called forward, oaths are sworn, but look closely at the faces in the crowd, and you'll notice something striking. While women are certainly present, observing the proceedings, they are not stepping forward to offer testimony, nor are they presenting their own cases. This isn't just about societal norms, it's about a deeply ingrained legal disadvantage. In the Lombard Kingdom of 643, had codified within the very pages of the Edict of Rothari, women were largely barred from acting as independent legal witnesses or from representing themselves in legal disputes. Their voice, in the formal setting of justice, was effectively silenced. Imagine a woman named Gisela. Her family's small farm lies adjacent to that of a quarrelsome neighbor, Odilo. One spring, Odilo, emboldened by a boundary stone mysteriously disappearing, begins to cultivate a strip of Gisela's prime meadowland, claiming it as his own. Gisela, who has watched her family tend that meadow for generations, knows unequivocally that Odilo is encroaching. She has seen him move the stone. She has witnessed his plowing. She possesses the facts, the truth, the direct evidence. Yet, when her father, her Munjuld, prepares to confront Odilo in the local court, Gisela knows she cannot simply step forward and tell her story. Edict of Rothari, the very framework of their legal system, did not recognize her as a valid independent witness capable of swearing an oath and having her testimony accepted on its own merit, particularly against a man her father, or perhaps her brother, would have to speak for her. He would be the one to present the case, to argue against Odilo, to call male witnesses who might have seen something, however indirectly. Gisela's direct observation, her knowledge of the land, would be relayed through a male intermediary, losing its direct force. This wasn't a question of intelligence or honesty. It was a matter of legal standing. The law presumed women were somehow less reliable in a formal legal setting, or perhaps it simply reflected a societal structure where legal authority was exclusively vested in men. The Edict of Rothari, in its various provisions, consistently places the burden of proof, the swearing of oaths, and the presentation of evidence upon male heads of households or male guardians. The absence of women from these roles is not an oversight. It is a fundamental aspect of their legal framework. Consider the immense frustration this must have caused. To know the truth, to have seen the wrongdoing with your own eyes, yet to be legally incapable of articulating it in the very place where justice was sought, meant that a woman's access to justice was entirely filtered through the willingness and capability of her male guardian. If her Munjuld was sickly, or timid, or perhaps even complicit in the wrongdoing, her chances of obtaining justice dwindled to nothing. Her injury, her loss, her claim was transformed from a personal grievance into a grievance of her Munjuld. If her father was away on a long journey or had passed on, and her new Munjuld, perhaps a distant uncle, was uninterested in her plight, Gisela would be left with virtually no recourse. This legal principle extended beyond mere testifying. A woman could not initiate a lawsuit in her own name. If she was accused of a crime, even a minor one, it would be her Munjuld who would stand in her place, present her defense, and argue her innocence. Her fate, her reputation, and her very freedom hinged on the legal acumen and dedication of her male guardian. The Edict of Rothari outlines detailed procedures for various legal disputes, from property theft to personal injury, and in almost every instance the parties involved are explicitly male. The law did not conceive of a woman as an independent legal actor. Think of a woman named Brunhild, accused of petty theft by a suspicious neighbor who swore he saw her near his orchard. Brunhild knew she was innocent. She had been tending her garden miles away that afternoon, but she could not stand before the reeve and refute the accusation herself. Her husband, Hermundswold, would have to present her defense, perhaps gather other male witnesses who could attest to her whereabouts. Brunhild's own voice, her own protestations of innocence, would carry little legal weight on their own. The very mechanism of Lombard justice was built around male participation and male authority. This limitation on legal testimony and representation was not merely a formality. It had profound practical consequences. It meant that women were more vulnerable to slander and false accusations, knowing that their direct rebuttals would be disregarded. It meant that their claims, even legitimate ones, might be dismissed if their male guardian was unable or unwilling to press them effectively. It enshrined a system where a woman's legal rights existed not as inherent entitlements, but as rights mediated and managed by another. The Edict of Rothari, and its meticulous detail about legal procedures and the payment of various compensations, implicitly and explicitly reinforced this male-centric legal landscape. When it speaks of oaths, of witness testimony, of presenting cases, it always refers to men. The role of women was to be acted upon, to be protected by or transferred between male guardians, but never to be the independent voice of legal action. This unspoken bar, this quiet exclusion from the very halls of justice, was a powerful and pervasive disadvantage that shaped every woman's life in the Lombard Kingdom. Number 5. Unequal protection and compensation for harm. Imagine a chilly gray day on a quiet country road, a lone woman walking with her basket, perhaps returning from a nearby market. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man emerges, attacking her, perhaps injuring her arm, or worse, stealing her meager belongings. It is a moment of terror, of violence, a clear violation of her safety and peace. In our modern world, we would expect justice to be swift and direct for the victim. But in the Lombard Kingdom of 643, as outlined in the Edict of Rothari, the very concept of justice for such an act was profoundly different for women. Protection they received, and the compensation for any harm inflicted upon them, was not directed to them as individuals, but rather to their male guardians, highlighting a deeply unequal legal standing. Consider the concept of wergild, a cornerstone of early Germanic law. Wergild was a fixed monetary compensation paid to the family of a person who was injured or killed, meant to prevent blood feuds and maintain peace. Every person had a wergild, a price, on their head, reflective of their status. For a free Lombard man, the wergild was substantial, often 1,200 solidi, a vast sum of gold. But what about a woman? The Edict of Rothari meticulously lists tariffs for various injuries, from a broken finger to a fatal blow. For women, these compensations were certainly outlined, but the crucial difference lay in who received the payment. If a man was injured, the wergild, or a portion of it, would go directly to him or to his immediate family for his loss of labor or suffering. If a woman was injured, the payment for her harm, her pain, her physical damage did not go to her. It went to her Hermundswold. Let's return to our woman. Helga, who was attacked on the road and suffered a broken arm. The Edict of Rothari specifies a certain payment for a broken arm, a sum of solidi to be paid by the assailant. But this payment, this restitution, would be given to Helga's father or her husband, whoever held her mundium. It was compensation for the injury to his dasset, to his property in a legal sense, rather than to Helga herself for her personal suffering or disability. Her body, in the eyes of the law, was under the dominion of her guardian, and thus any harm to it was a harm to his authority and his investment. This principle underscored the pervasive nature of mundium. A woman's body, her labor, her very being, was valued in terms of its connection to her male guardian. This legal framework extended to even more egregious offenses. The Edict of Rothari contains detailed provisions regarding the abduction of women, for instance. If a woman was carried off against her will, the law certainly provided for serious penalties. But again, the focus of the compensation was not on the woman's violated autonomy or trauma. Instead, the law stipulated a hefty fine to be paid to her munduold for the theft or removal of his dependent. Article 187 of the edict, for example, discusses a payment of 900 solidi to the father or her munduold if a free woman is abducted. It was a payment for the infringement of the guardian's rights, for the disruption of his household and the potential dishonor brought upon his family. The woman herself, though the direct victim of a terrifying ordeal, received no direct monetary compensation for her ordeal. Her legal standing was such that her suffering was translated into a loss for her male protector. Think about the implications of this. It meant that a woman's physical safety was protected not because she had inherent rights to bodily autonomy, but because she was a valuable asset to her family and her guardian. Her value was tied to her role within the male-dominated family structure. This is not to say that Lombard men did not care for their women, or that they did not feel outrage at such acts. Of course they did. The law, as written in 643, had channeled that protection and compensation through a distinctly patriarchal lens. The suffering of a woman was quantifiable as a loss to her guardian. Consider a different scenario. A woman named Frida who, while walking to the well, was accidentally struck by a runaway cart, suffering a grievous leg injury that would leave her with a permanent limp. The Edict of Rothari would specify a certain weregild for such an injury, paid by the cart owner. This money would be handed over to Frida's husband. He would decide how to use it, perhaps for healers, perhaps for other family needs. Frida herself would have no legal claim to that money. Her personal suffering and the long-term impact on her life were compensated, but the compensation flowed through the hands of her male guardian. She was protected, yes, but her protection was mediated, and the restitution was for her guardian's loss of her unhindered labor or her unimpaired presence within his household. This concept of unequal protection permeated various aspects of legal redress. Even in cases of defamation or insult, where a woman's honor might be assailed, the legal remedy was often in the form of a fine paid to her munduold. It was the guardian's honor, or his authority over his dependent, that was deemed to have been offended rather than the woman's individual reputation. The Edict of Rothari, in its meticulous listing of fines for various affronts, consistently directs the payment to the male guardian or head of the household. This system of unequal protection and compensation had a profound impact on a woman's perception of her own worth and her place in society. While she was undoubtedly cherished within her family, the law explicitly defined her value in terms of her relation to men. Her physical safety, her emotional well-being, even her very life, had a price. But that price was primarily for the benefit of her male protector. It was a legal framework that ensured that while women were not without legal recourse, that recourse was always through the hands of a man, and the resulting compensation flowed into the hands of a man. This was a striking disadvantage, demonstrating that a woman's legal identity was perpetually subsumed under the authority of her male guardian. Protection she received was a reflection of her guardian's rights, not her own inherent individual entitlements. Number 4. The transactional nature of marriage and lack of consent. Imagine a young Lombard woman barely past her childhood, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, her days filled with the rhythms of household tasks, the weaving of fine linen, and the chatter of her sisters. She might dream of her future, of a home of her own, perhaps even of a kind husband. But in the Lombard Kingdom of 643, the reality of marriage for this young woman was often far removed from any romantic notions or personal choice. Marriage, as outlined and regulated by the Edict of Rothari, was fundamentally a legal and economic transaction between families, a powerful alliance of kin, with the woman herself having little to no say in the matter. Her consent, in the modern sense, was not a required component of the legal process. Consider a young woman named Rania. She wakes one morning to the news that her father has arranged her marriage to a man she barely knows, perhaps a warrior from a powerful clan in the neighboring village, or an older, wealthy landowner seeking a new wife. There would be no courtship, no discussion of her preferences, no opportunity for her to accept or reject the proposal. The negotiations would have taken place entirely between her father, her Munjwald, and the prospective groom or his family. The Edict of Rothari meticulously details these procedures, describing payments and agreements that must occur between the male parties involved. The most significant of these was the mundium payment itself, made by the prospective husband to the bride's father or guardian. This was essentially the price paid for the transfer of the woman's legal guardianship, her mundium, from her father to her new husband. It was not a payment for the woman, but a payment to her guardian for relinquishing his legal control over her. Think about the implications of this. A woman was a valuable commodity, a means of forging alliances, of securing land, of producing heirs. Her individual desires, her personal feelings, were secondary to the strategic interests of her family. The Edict of Rothari makes no mention of a woman's consent being required for a marriage to be legally valid. Instead, it focuses on the proper procedures for the transfer of mundium and the exchange of payments. If the mundium was properly paid to the father or guardian, and the morgengab, mourning gift, was given by the husband to the bride on the morning after the consummation, the marriage was legally sound, regardless of the woman's actual wishes. Imagine the sense of powerlessness. Rania might have hoped to marry a young man from her own village, someone she knew and perhaps even admired. But if her father deemed a marriage to a wealthy but unknown elder from afar to be more advantageous for the family's prestige or economic security, Rania would be expected to comply. To refuse could bring shame upon her family, disrupt vital alliances, and potentially lead to severe repercussions. The law provided no avenue for a woman to legally object to an arranged marriage, assuming the proper legal protocols of mundium transfer and payments were observed. This legal framework also had profound consequences for divorce. While the Edict of Rothari outlined specific, though limited, grounds for a man to divorce his wife primarily if she attempted to kill him, was a sorceress, or committed adultery, it provides virtually no avenue for a woman to initiate a divorce. Her only recourse, if her marriage was unbearable, or if her husband was abusive, was often to flee back to her father's household. Even then, her father would have to deal with her husband, and she might still be legally bound to him. The Edict of Rothari, in its provisions regarding marriage and separation, consistently puts the agency and decision-making power in the hands of the husband and the male guardians. The woman's role was largely passive, to be given, received, and potentially dismissed. Consider the case of a woman named Theudelinda. She might have been married off to a man with a cruel streak who treated her harshly. Under Lombard law, her only legal recourse would be if his cruelty threatened her life in a way that could be legally proven by her father or another male relative. Minor abuse, emotional neglect, or simply an unbearable temperament on the husband's part were not grounds for Theudelinda to seek a legal separation. She was legally bound to him, her mundium transferred, and her life now under his direct authority, until her father or another male relative could intervene and even then it would be a negotiation between men, not a direct legal action by Theodolinda herself. This transactional view of marriage extended even to cases of abduction or forced marriage. While the Edict of Rothari severely punished the abductor, the focus of the law was on the violation of the Munjwal's authority and a potential dishonor to the family, not on the woman's violated bodily autonomy or lack of consent. If the abductor later formalized the union by paying the mundium to the woman's father, the marriage could be rendered legitimate in the eyes of the law, essentially legitimizing a forced union by fulfilling the financial and legal requirements between the men. The woman's lack of consent to the initial abduction or to the subsequent forced marriage was not a primary legal consideration for voiding the union if the proper payments were made. The Edict of Rothari, in its detailed regulations concerning bride, price, mourning gift, and the transfer of guardianship, reveals a legal system where marriage was a carefully choreographed transfer of property and authority. A woman was the object of this transfer, not an active participant in the decision-making process. Her legal standing, her future happiness, and her very autonomy were decided by others, fulfilling a societal and legal framework that burnatized family alliances and male control above individual. This fundamental legal disadvantage ensured that for most women in 643 at Lombardy marriage was an arrangement made for them, not with them, a powerful reflection of their subordinate legal status. Number 3. Limited property, rights, and inheritance. Imagine a small plot of land, fertile and well-tended, that has been in a family for generations. It represents security, sustenance, and a legacy. Now, picture a woman, perhaps a wise and experienced elder, who has personally worked that land for decades alongside her husband. Her hands gnarled from the toil, her knowledge of the soil unparalleled. She knows every furrow, every stone, every season. Yet, in the Lombard Kingdom of 643, as defined by the Edict of Rothari, her legal rights over that very land, and indeed over most forms of property, were severely restricted, often rendering her a mere custodian rather than an outright owner. This was a profound legal disadvantage, ensuring that control of wealth and land remained predominantly in male hands, even in cases where a woman had a clear moral claim. While it is true that women in Lombard society could possess certain forms of property, such as their personal adornments, household goods, and the morgengab received from their husbands, a mourning gift often consisting of movable property like jewelry or household items, their ability to own and control significant assets, particularly land, was highly circumscribed. The Edict of Rothari, in its extensive regulations on inheritance and property transfers, consistently burnatizes male heirs and dictates that property should largely remain within the male line of the family. Consider a woman named Thuringa. Her husband, Wulfric, a hard-working farmer, dies unexpectedly, leaving behind their modest farm and a few cows. Thuringa has adult sons and perhaps some younger daughters. According to the Edict of Rothari, the primary inheritors of Wulfric's land and most of his property would be his sons. Thuringa, as his widow, would not automatically inherit the land in fee simple, meaning she would not gain full ownership and the right to dispose of it as she wished. Instead, she would often retain a right to use the land, to live on it, and draw sustenance from it for her lifetime. A kind of usufruct right, but the actual ownership and ultimate control would pass to her sons. Her ability to sell the land, to mortgage it, or to pass it on to her daughters in her own will was severely limited, if not entirely impossible without the consent of her male heirs or her current munjwal. This was a stark contrast to male inheritance patterns, where land and property would typically pass from father to son without such encumbrances. The legal rationale was rooted in the Lombard belief that land and the power that came with it should remain within the male lineage, ensuring continuity and stability for the clan. Women, through marriage, might join another family, and allowing them full control over inherited land could dilute or fragment the ancestral holdings. The Edict of Rothari's provisions on inheritance strongly reflect this patriarchal emphasis, meticulously outlining how property passes through male lines, with female inheritance being secondary and subject to significant restrictions. Imagine another scenario. A woman named Lena, who was her father's only child. One might think that upon his death she would inherit everything, but under Lombard law, this was rarely the case, especially if there were male relatives, even distant ones. The Edict of Rothari often stipulated that in the absence of sons, the inheritance of land would pass to male collaterals, brothers, uncles, nephews of the deceased, while Lena might receive her share of movable goods or some form of sustenance. The ancestral lands, the very foundation of the family's wealth and status, would typically be directed away from her. The law made explicit provisions for the legal heir to receive the property, and that heir was overwhelmingly male. This legal disadvantage created a continuous cycle of female economic dependency. Even if a woman brought property into a marriage as a dowry, though this was less common in Lombard law than in Roman or later medieval systems, her husband would gain control over it, and upon his death, it would likely pass to their sons, not revert to her with full control. Her wealth was always managed, always mediated, and always ultimately destined for the male line. Edict of Rothari's sections on marriage and property outline how the husband receives his wife's mundium, effectively placing all her legal and economic agency under his authority. Consider the practical implications. If a woman had aspirations to manage a large estate, to engage in significant trade, or to invest in new ventures, her limited property rights severely hampered her. She could not use land as collateral, she could not independently raise capital, and her wealth, such as it was usually tied up in her personal effects or household items, not in the productive assets of land and significant capital. Even the Morgengabe, while legally hers, was often viewed as a security payment for her well-being should her husband die, and its full control remained linked to her status as a wife or widow under mundium. The Edict of Rothari, in its desire to bring order and clarity to Lombard society, enshrined a legal system where property and power were intimately linked, and both were overwhelmingly reserved for men. The detailed provisions regarding land ownership, inheritance rules, and the transfer of wealth consistently favored male heirs and male control. Women, while essential to the family unit and household, were systematically excluded from the full and independent ownership of significant wealth, particularly real estate. This pervasive legal disadvantage meant that a woman's economic security and her capacity for independent action were always circumscribed by her relationship to male guardians and the deeply ingrained patriarchal norms of inheritance. It was a law that ensured wealth and power flowed down the male line, consolidating control and limiting the economic autonomy of women across the Lombard Kingdom. Number 2. Restricted control over personal autonomy and bodily integrity. Imagine a woman named Ermentrude, strong-willed and independent in spirit, who works hard in her home, tending to her family and contributing to her household's daily survival. She believes she should have the right to make decisions about her own body, her own labor, and her own future. Yet, in the Lombard Kingdom of 643, as codified in the Edict of Rothari, her personal autonomy and her bodily integrity were not considered inherent individual rights in the way we understand them today. Instead, these fundamental aspects of her existence were largely controlled and managed by her male guardian, her munduald, reflecting a profound legal disadvantage where her body and her choices were legally subject to another's authority. This restriction was multifaceted, deeply intertwined with the pervasive concept of mundium. Because a woman was always under the legal guardianship of a male, her decisions about her person, from her movement to her labor, and even aspects of her reproduction, were often implicitly or explicitly subject to his approval or control. The Edict of Rothari, while not explicitly listing a right to bodily autonomy as we know it, nevertheless shows through its various provisions that a woman's body was considered in a legal sense an asset of her guardian. Consider the simple act of travel. If Ermentrude wished to visit her ailing sister in a distant village, a journey that might take several days, she could not simply pack her bag and go. She would need the permission of her Mundjewald, her father, husband, or other male guardian. If she left without permission, especially if she was a wife, she could be considered a runaway, and her husband would have legal recourse to compel her return or even claim damages from anyone who harbored her. Edict of Rothari was concerned with the stability of the household and the authority of the male head, and unauthorized movement by a woman was seen as a challenge to that order. Her physical presence, her location, was under the control of her guardian, reinforcing the idea that her body was not fully her own to direct. The most striking illustration of this restricted autonomy, however, lies in the legal provisions concerning sexual offenses and the concept of sexual integrity. While the Edict of Rothari certainly had laws against rape and sexual assault, the compensation for these offenses was primarily directed to the woman's Mundjewald, not to the woman herself. The law viewed such acts not as a violation of the woman's personal autonomy and consent, but as an injury to the guardian's legal authority and the honor of his household. For instance, if a woman was raped, the perpetrator would face a severe fine, but this fine would be paid to her father or husband, whoever held her mundium, as compensation for the harm done to their property and their family's reputation. The woman's own trauma and violated consent were not the primary focus of the legal remedy. She was a victim, but her legal redress was indirect. Imagine a young woman named Freya violently assaulted by a stranger. Her ordeal would be agonizing. The legal process following such an event would not be centered on Freya's healing or her individual rights. It would be centered on her father's ability to bring a claim on his honor and on the monetary compensation due to him for the transgression. The Edict of Rothari meticulously details these payments, consistently directing them to the male guardian, never to the woman herself. This legal framing fundamentally undermined a woman's claim to independent bodily integrity. Her body's value was defined by her relation to her guardian, not by her inherent human dignity. This extended to even more intimate aspects of a woman's life, such as childbearing. While the Edict of Rothari does not explicitly detail laws regarding forced pregnancy or contraception, the overarching control of a woman's life by her Mundjewald implicitly covered her reproductive capacity. Her primary purpose within the marriage was often to bear children, particularly sons, to continue the family line. Her labor both in the household and in the fields was also considered part of the economic asset she represented to her husband. If a husband wanted his wife to perform certain tasks or to manage the household in a particular way, her legal obligation was to comply, as her mundium resided with him. Consider the pressure on women like Ermentrude to produce heirs, particularly male ones. While not a direct legal disadvantage in the sense of a prohibited act, the societal expectation backed by the legal emphasis on male lineage in inheritance, as seen in our previous point, meant that a woman's worth was often intrinsically tied to her reproductive output for her husband's family. If she failed to produce male heirs or any children at all, her position within the family could become precarious, even if the law did not directly punish her. The concept of personal autonomy over one's reproductive choices simply did not exist for women in this era. The Edict of Rothari, in its comprehensive effort to codify Lombard law, reinforces the idea that women were not fully independent legal persons capable of making decisions about their own bodies or movements without the consent of their male guardians. Their physical presence, their sexual integrity, and even their daily labor were all considered to be under the purview of the Mundjewald. This continuous oversight, this legal claim by a man over a woman's very person, was a profound and constant disadvantage. It meant that a woman's life, from her most intimate experiences to her daily movements, was lived within boundaries set and enforced by male authority, preventing her from exercising true personal autonomy. Number 1. The invisible chains of mundium. Imagine a bright, crisp morning in the Lombard countryside, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A young woman named Alda, perhaps in her late teens, watches her brothers haggle over a sheep at the village market. She has a sharp mind, a keen eye for a good bargain, and she knows the value of wool better than any of them. Having spent countless hours at the loom, transforming raw fleece into strong thread, yet she stands silent, observing her voice unheard in the boisterous throng. Why? Because Alda, like every other woman in the Lombard Kingdom of 643, had lived under the perpetual shadow of something called mundium. This wasn't a physical chain, no iron bound around her wrists, but it was a legal bond, so absolute, so pervasive, that it shaped her entire life, from the cradle to the grave. Mundium, in its simplest form, was the legal guardianship of a woman by a man. It sounds almost polite, doesn't it, like a father watching over his daughter? But in the Lombard legal system, particularly as codified in the Edict of Rothari in 643, ad mundium was far more than paternal care. It was a fundamental legal principle that stripped women of their independent legal identity. A woman could not own property outright. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue someone. She could not defend herself in court. She could not even freely choose a husband, all without the express permission and involvement of her munjwald, her guardian. Her legal standing, her very right to exist as a person in the eyes of the law, was entirely subsumed by her male protector. This was not a temporary state, like childhood, from which one eventually emerged into independent adulthood. For women in Lombard society, mundium was a lifelong condition, a legal status that never truly lifted. Think about that for a moment. Every single interaction a woman had with the legal world, every single transaction that involved her rights or her assets, had to pass through the filter of her munjwal debt. If Alda wanted to sell a small plot of inherited land that technically was hers by lineage but not truly hers to dispose of, her father, as her munjwald, had to approve the sale, handle the negotiations, and receive the payment. If she were wronged, perhaps someone stole her chickens or assaulted her, it was not Alda who brought the complaint to the king's reeve or the local assembly. It was her father or her brother or later her husband. Her voice, her injury, her suffering became an extension of her munjwald's legal personality. The Edict of Rothari, that ancient document of Lombard law, clearly spells out these arrangements, detailing payments and procedures that consistently place the male guardian at the center of any woman's legal affairs. The very structure of the legal text assumes male action and male responsibility for female legal matters. This system was deeply rooted in Lombard society's understanding of family power and property. The Edict of Rothari reflects a world where strong family lines, particularly male ones, were paramount. The lineage, the land, the power, all flowed through men. Women were seen as integral to the family's continuation, certainly, but not as independent agents. Their role was tied to reproduction, to managing the household, and to upholding the family's honor, always under the authority of a male head. Mundium was the legal mechanism that enforced this societal structure. It wasn't just a custom, it was the law of the land written down and enforced with meticulous detail. Consider the complexity this added to a woman's life. Imagine Alda now married to a man named Tuto. Her munjwald would no longer be her father, but Tuto himself, her legal identity being transferred from one male guardian to another. If Tuto were to die, Alda would not suddenly become her own woman, free to manage her affairs independently. Instead, her mundium would pass to her sons if they were adults, or her deceased husband's brothers, or even the king if no other suitable male relative existed. She was never truly free of this legal oversight. This was a perpetual state of legal childhood, regardless of a woman's age, wisdom, or practical experience. Her wisdom in managing a complex household, her skill in trading goods, her innate intelligence all counted for little in the eyes of the law when it came to independent legal action. The Edict of Rothari, for instance, dedicates significant sections to the procedures surrounding mundium, especially in matters of marriage and inheritance. It dictates that for a woman to be given in marriage, the munjuled must receive a payment, often called the mundium itself, from the prospective husband. This payment was not for the woman. It was for the guardian, compensating him for relinquishing his legal control over her. It was a transaction pure and simple, acknowledging the transfer of legal authority over a person. The woman herself received a morgengab, a mourning gift from her new husband, but this was her husband's gift to her, not a direct payment in exchange for her own consent or agency. Core transaction was always between the men recognizing and affirming the transfer of legal power over the woman. This constant dependency meant that a woman's safety, her well-being, and her access to justice were entirely reliant on the diligence and fairness of her munjuled. What if her munjuled was abusive? What if he was negligent? What if he made poor decisions that impacted her detrimentally? Edict of Rothari offered very little recourse for a woman in such a situation. Her primary path to justice was through another male relative who might intervene on her behalf, essentially asking one munjul to be checked by another. The system was designed to contain and control, not to empower or protect a woman as an individual with inherent rights. If a woman felt unsafe with her munjuled, her only hope might lie in appealing to her father's family to reclaim her mundium. But this was a complex legal maneuver, often difficult to achieve, and still meant she would simply be under a different male's control. The depth of this legal disadvantage is hard for us to fully grasp today. It meant that a woman could not, for example, independently engage in trade on a large scale, even if she possessed keen business acumen. She could not sue a neighbor who trespassed on her property, even if that property was her dower land. If her husband, her munjuled, mistreated her, her only hope might lie in her father's family. If they chose to involve themselves, even then, it would be her father or brother who brought the legal complaint, not her. Her voice was muted, her legal identity subsumed, her destiny inextricably linked to the decisions of a man who held her mundium. The Edict of Rothari provides precise tariffs for various injuries or offenses, and almost without exception, the payment for an injury to a woman went to her munjuled, not to her. Her body, her labor, her very life was seen as an asset whose value was owned and managed by her male guardian. This foundational disadvantage, the invisible chain of mundium, colored every other aspect of a woman's legal reality in 643 ad Lombardi. It was the bedrock upon which all other limitations were built, making it the most pervasive and defining disadvantage for women in that ancient kingdom. Its influence was inescapable, shaping daily life, legal interactions, and personal destinies in ways that are truly astonishing to consider.